Hey everyone, how is it going? I come to you today with a book review. I want to talk today about this book. This is Marsha, The Joy and Defiance of Marsha P. Johnson, written by Tourmaline. This was just published this year. It was published on May 20th of 2025. So kudos to me for actually reading a new release for once. So this is, as far as I know, and it's being billed in this way, this is the first full-length biography of Marsha P. Johnson. So, to talk a little bit to start off with about who Marsha P. Johnson is, and then at some point I'm also going to actually talk about the author, Tourmaline, just a little bit, but I want to talk about Marsha P. Johnson first, because a lot of people may not know very much about her. And she is such a fascinating and I think important figure in the late 20th century and just in particular in gay, queer, and trans history. So Marsha P. Johnson lived from the year 1945 to 1992. She was a pivotal leader in the gay liberation movement. She was actually present at the Stonewall riots. So the Stonewall riots, again, for anyone who is unfamiliar, happened in 1969. They were a series of riots that happened over the course of a few nights at the Stonewall Inn, which was a gay bar in New York City. And the Stonewall riots kind of broke out spontaneously when there was a police raid on the Stonewall Inn. Police raids were not uncommon in gay bars at that time because technically serving alcohol to gay people was illegal. A lot of those bars were run by the mafia and so on and so forth. I can't go into too much detail about that. But police raids on gay bars were not uncommon at the time. But the Stonewall riots broke out when certain queer people at the Stonewall Inn, excuse me, my cat is coming to say hi, we just got fed up with this police raid that occurred in June of 1969. I believe it was June 28th when the Stonewall riots actually began, and that's why June is Pride Month. And Marsha P. Johnson was present at the Stonewall riots. Records of that night and the subsequent nights are a little bit hazy. There was no one there taking down everything that happened. There was no one recording, taking video footage of what happened. So events of the nights are a little bit fuzzy, but she was there, and she was definitely pivotal in the Stonewall riots and went on to continue being important in the gay liberation movement that sprung up out of it. So the importance of the Stonewall riots, which sometimes are referred to as the Stonewall Uprising, is that they really kickstarted the modern gay liberation movement. And she went on to continue being important in the gay liberation movement in various the Gay Liberation Front, for example, the Gay Activists Alliance she was involved with, and so on and so forth. She also was a drag queen. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about her as a person in a second. She was a drag queen. She was a performer. And she was kind of a really interesting performer. She was a drag queen, for one thing, so she did drag. But then she also was in a couple of different theater troupes who did these off-Broadway shows. So she was a member of the Hot Peaches and the Angels of Light. So these two theater troupes that did off-Broadway shows. So she was kind of also a provocative kind of performer and artist and fashion, not necessarily designer, but wearer of fashion. I don't know what the word is, but so she was also an artist, right? In a really provocative way. She also in her life was involved in AIDS activism. As you could have seen by the years of her life, she did live through the height of the AIDS crisis. Really, she died kind of when it was when the AIDS crisis was still ongoing. But she was involved in AIDS activism. Eventually, she was involved with ACT UP. But she also helped care for some of her friends who were dying of AIDS. And another big kind of piece of Marsha's life that's really important to her legacy is she, along with Sylvia Rivera, who was herself a trans woman of Puerto Rican heritage, they started an organization called STAR, which stands for Street Transvestites Action Revolutionaries. And they basically housed and fed and gave community to trans women in particular, who were homeless and struggling. And that lasted for a few years, from I think 1969 to 1972 or 3. And then on top of all that, Marsha P. Johnson was just a lovely person. She was known as Saint Marsha just because of how giving she was and how motherly she was. She was sort of a mother figure to a lot of young queer people, and in particular a lot of young trans women. And she was sometimes called the mayor of Christopher Street for this reason as well, the mayor of Christopher Street. And so to get to more about Marsha's identity, she was also, on top of all this, a black trans woman. And as, again, you can see over the years that she lived, born in 1945, she did not live through a time where it was particularly easy to be a trans woman or a black trans woman, to the degree that it's any easier nowadays, which, of course, I will talk about in a bit. But she was a black trans woman and also a drag queen. She spent most of her life homeless. She often had to turn to sex work to get by. She also struggled with her mental health. She had a few breakdowns in her life, usually precipitated by either the death of a lover. She had a couple of lovers throughout her life, or a lover leaving her, a relationship falling apart. And then in the last few years of her life, she also had HIV. So she died in 1992, and by that description, what I've just said, I know it's all an earful, she lived quite a packed life. I mean, she didn't even see 50, and she did more than most people would do with 75 or 80 years of life. And then her death, she died tragically at the age of 45 or 46, I believe. And the circumstances of her death as well are really just fascinating and troubling. She was found in the Hudson River in New York City. Her body was pulled up, and the New York Police Department, when they found her, initially just ruled it a suicide. They just kind of assumed, well, she's in the water, it looks like she probably drowned herself. That's probably what happened. And they just kind of slapped that on to the case for her and then closed it. They didn't really do any further investigation. And in the book, actually, a lot is made about how that speaks to how the police have often kind of minimized the tragedy of the deaths of people of color, but also in particular trans people of color, right? But queer people in general as well. But there was some evidence that came up suggesting that her death may not have been a suicide, that she may have actually been attacked that night, that her death may have been a murder at worst, but possibly also manslaughter. It may have been an accident brought on by her being attacked by transphobes or homophobes at nighttime. And so there was a sort of Justice for Marsha campaign that got the NYPD to change the cause of death for her from suicide to undetermined. Right? So there's a lot to discuss with Marsha, right? She had a packed life, fascinating individual, and I will just say now that her life, her work, and how she lived her life and did her work, just hopefully it doesn't need too much explaining from me, are almost more relevant now than they were at the time she died, although Lord knows they were more than relevant at the time she died, right? In the United States right now, we see gay, queer, and trans rights being rolled back. We see attempts to basically erase trans people from existence, and people who are not trans but are members of the queer community, who are members of the alphabet soup, who think that they're safe from any of this, are deluding themselves. The right wing of this country is attacking trans people because they're the most vulnerable people, so they're the easiest to attack. But we should all be aware that they are going to come for the rest of us soon. Not that should be the only reason for caring. We should just care about trans people because they're worthy of living dignified lives. But I'm getting a little bit off topic. Marsha's life and work and activism are almost more important now than they were when she died, right? Because we have an administration right now, a presidential administration, that is unbelievably hostile to all members of the queer community, right? The fact that Donald Trump appointed a gay man to his cabinet notwithstanding, he is profoundly hostile to the queer community, trans, gay, bisexual, or otherwise. And I will say also that just the way that Marsha lived her life was, I think, really relevant. She was, from a very young age, totally unapologetic about who she was. She, from her childhood, was dressing in women's clothes, right? Against the wishes of her parents, usually. But still, she was just doing it, and she just said, this is who I am, this is what I like doing, this is what I'm going to do. And when she turned 18, she just left home and went to New York City to live her truth. And she did that her entire life. And so she is an example for a lot of us to follow, not just us among the queer community, but people across the world, I think. All right, so that's a lot. That was an earful about Marsha P. Johnson. There's a lot about her life I did not do justice to talking about that. But there are other resources to go to about her life, one of which is the book that I am ostensibly reviewing here. Okay, so the book, turning more to the book. Now, a lot of what I just talked about, I learned in this book. So, for one thing, you know already that I did learn a lot from the book. So, I will start at the outset that I recommend this book. And at the end of this video, I want to talk about who specifically I would recommend it to, but I can recommend it. I want to talk briefly about the author, Tourmaline, and then I'll go into my thoughts on the book just as a book. So Tourmaline is an interesting individual in her own right. She is an activist and a filmmaker. She's actually more well known as a filmmaker than as a writer. This is her first book, which she is publishing alongside a kind of other version of this book for kids, targeted at kids. And she herself is a queer trans woman of color. A black trans woman, I should say. And I should say as well, she appears to be quite qualified to write such a book. She actually was involved in kind of archiving primary sources and information about Marsha before she ever thought of writing a biography. So in her introduction, Tourmaline writes of her interest in Marsha, quote, "I decided to learn more about Marsha, and I soon found myself becoming one of the leading archivists of her story. I reached out to her friends, and they shared with me stories, photos, and video recordings that captured her life. I sourced VHS tapes from her friends and posted films of her speaking online. I digitized articles that were gathering dust in library boxes," and so on and so forth. So she was involved in kind of documenting Marsha's life long before she was going to write this book. And she has also released a short film about Marsha called Happy Birthday, Marsha, which I have not watched yet, but I want to just put it on the radar of anyone who's watching this. I want to watch it. I, again, can't speak to it because I haven't watched it, but she has also directed a film about Marsha. So she knows Marsha. She knows Marsha's story, right? Because she's been archiving her life for a long time. Now, to talk about the things about this book that were good, and there were a lot of them. Again, as I said already, I learned a ton from this book. Another good thing about this book is I think that, like with all really, really good biographies, it's also kind of a history of the times that the person lived in. And that is definitely true of this book. So this book is a really good, just sort of basic history of the gay liberation movement and the beginning of the AIDS crisis, I will say, because that becomes a big theme in the later sections of the book. But also just queer life in the 20th century, in particular the life of trans women of color, because so many themes that recur when you start learning about the lives of trans women of color are dealt with in this book. A lot of trans women have lived lives not unlike Marsha's, spending a lot of time homeless, turning to sex work. A lot of them do disproportionately end up with HIV, right? And I don't mean to paint a super bleak picture of that, but it is the reality. And the book also does a good job, though, of emphasizing the joy that Marsha had in her life. Especially talking about her as a performer, right? The art that she made, and who she was as a person. She was always a very joyful person. But anyway, I'm getting a little bit off track. The book is a very good history of the gay liberation movement and queer life in the second half of the 20th century. And like I said, it's a really good discussion of a lot of issues that come up in the lives of trans women in particular. So there's a lot of good, a lot to be learned in this book. Now turning to some cons, some reservations, I will say. The writing in this is mostly good. It's mostly a fairly well-written book. I get the sense that it is kind of targeted at the widest audience possible. So it's meant to be very accessible, which sometimes can mean that it's not maybe as scholarly as one might like it to be. That doesn't mean it needs to be stuffy and pompous sounding, but sometimes I might have just liked it to be a bit more reined in and a bit more buttoned down and not necessarily academic, but a bit more rigorous perhaps at times. I did find at times the writing to be somewhat unpolished. I think Tourmaline maybe was in need of an editor to look over this one more time, because she does sometimes repeat herself. So she will introduce a person who crosses paths with Marsha, or an organization like the Hot Peaches or ACT UP or whoever. She'll introduce them, as you would of course do in a biography, on one page, and then a few pages later she'll bring them up and then reintroduce them all over again as though you've never heard of them. And that struck me as something that needed an editor, I think. Because when a writer just starts repeating themselves like that without seeming to realize it, it suggests that they needed a little bit more polishing, I think. She also sometimes does have a tendency to speak in kind of broad abstractions. So she has a tendency to kind of speak in these broad, abstract ideas about what we should take away from whatever's going on in Marsha's life, or an incident that she talks about in the book. So one kind of example that I have from the book, I'll quote it for you. So here's the quote. Following the Christopher Street Liberation Day March, the Gay Action Alliance also hosted a large gay liberation dance party at New York University. During the preparation for the party, the president of GAA refused to allow a black trans person, Natasha, to perform. The GAA justified their actions with anti-drag and anti-trans sentiments that continue today, saying that drag queens were a mockery of quote-unquote real women. So the part of that I'm pointing out is that last part. So the thing is that Tourmaline doesn't trust the reader to get that saying that drag queens are a mockery of real women. She doesn't trust the reader enough to get that is anti-drag and anti-trans, right? She feels the need to spell it out for you, right? So there's a bit of telling at times and not showing, or at least not trusting the showing to actually show the reader what the point she wants to make. I hope that makes sense. And then just two more smaller things. One is that Tourmaline does something that a lot of nonfiction writers seem to do and that I've never really liked. Even in books that I do otherwise really love, nonfiction writers will do it, where they kind of write in a kind of novelistic style, where they kind of try to write as though they had access to the inner thoughts and feelings of a person that they're writing about. And it always kind of bugs me, because no matter how deep your knowledge of a real person is, you cannot have access to their inner thoughts and feelings while they were experiencing whatever happened in their lives. And so I don't like it when nonfiction writers put on the facade of knowing it. I don't like that. Even though it does make for engaging reading, and they probably are trying to appeal to a wider audience who maybe are more used to reading fiction, it's not my favorite thing. And then, last little thing, I don't want to make a huge deal out of this, but I can't help but notice that Janet Mock, who wrote a really great memoir called Redefining Realness. Janet Mock wrote, so Redefining Realness was a memoir of Janet Mock growing up as a trans woman of color, and it's a great, great book. What bugs me is that Janet Mock is blurbed on the back of the book and on the front of the book, and is also quoted in the book, in the text of the book. And I always get, that always strikes me as a little bit of a red flag when there's a blurb from someone who is referenced in the book. It just doesn't seem very objective. And then finally, again, I don't want to make a huge deal out of this, but Tourmaline seems to do a little bit of self-promoting through this book. She brings up her own film, Happy Birthday, Marsha, a couple times in this, and brings it up in such a way where you do kind of get the sense that she's trying to nudge you to go watch it. And I didn't love that. That felt self-promoting, and I didn't love it. I don't love seeing that in any kind of in the nonfiction I'm reading. So that's that. So, but on the whole, I would recommend this book. As I said, I would recommend it in particular to people interested in Marsha P. Johnson. I mean, this is a must-read. Okay, yeah, because this is, as far as I know, the only full-length biography of her out there. So if you were interested in her, definitely read it. You'll learn a lot about her. If you're interested in gay history, in particular the history of the gay liberation movement, definitely a worthy read. If you are interested in the lives of trans women, especially trans women of color, also a great informative read. And also, I will say, this is a bit more niche and maybe a bit less the target audience, but if you're kind of interested in like underground or street performers, there's a lot about that in this book because of the performance art that Marsha did as a drag performer, and with the Hot Peaches and the Angels of Light. She did these off Broadway shows, but she also performed on the West End and all these things. And she also had sort of this thing where she would actually walk around the city and just sort of pick little pieces of clothing up out of the trash and like put them on and create her own fashion statement. There's a lot of cool stuff like that. And so if you're interested in that sort of thing, I think you would also like this book. So, and then before I finish here, I also just want to recommend, if you maybe aren't inclined to read a whole book about Marsha P. Johnson, I would recommend the documentary, The Death and Life of Marsha P. Johnson, which is a Netflix original. I cannot remember the director off the top of my head, but the information will be below. So if you maybe aren't inclined to read a whole book about Marsha, maybe watch that film. It's not super long. It's not perfect either, but it's informative. It'll tell you a lot about her life and her work and everything. So I wanted to recommend that as well. So thank you all for watching. Please, if you have thoughts about the book or about Marsha P. Johnson, or responses or questions about anything I said, please feel free to leave a comment. But otherwise, I will talk to you all again soon. Bye.